7 layers, 29 entries. This is an iceberg of things you absolutely should never search up. We'll start with the disturbing and slowly make our way to some of the most vile things I could find on the internet. This iceberg certainly isn't for everyone, so viewer discretion is highly advised. Level 1. The Pariah Pipeline Incident. There are certain tragedies that are unavoidable. You can call them a work of fate. However, there are some that are completely preventable and only turn into tragedies because of gross negligence. The Pariah Pipeline Incident is one of the biggest examples of that. On February 25, 2022, 5 divers working under LMCS Limited were tasked with repairing an oil pipeline owned by Pariah Fuel Trading Company near the Trinidad and Tobago town of Pointe-au-Pierre. Things seemed to be going perfectly fine for the 5 men who had taken off their scuba gear at an air chamber beneath the opening of the pipe. But the problem came when the inflatable cover of the pipe wouldn't come off. The divers didn't think much of it and manually shimmied the cover off, but that was precisely where things became deadly. Due to the pressure difference between the air chamber and the pipe, a vacuum effect was created, forcefully sucking all 5 men into the 30-inch dark pipe. What's worse was that the lack of light and direction made their escape not just difficult, it made it almost impossible. Naturally, they were disoriented and severely injured from the massive pressure difference. A few minutes later, after trying to get themselves together as much as possible, all 5 divers decided to move forward, crawling slowly but surely toward what they predicted was the pipe's opening. Unfortunately, things only got worse from there. 3 of the divers, Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, and Rishi Nagasar, were understandably shaken and couldn't bring themselves to keep going, knowing the pipe likely had parts fully submerged underwater. The other 2, Faisal Kurban and Christopher Boudram, kept going, hoping to find an end to their nightmare. Halfway through, Faisal told Christopher that he was completely exhausted and just couldn't go on. Christopher Boudram, the only survivor, somehow fought his way out of the pipe hours after the incident. But when he escaped, there was no emergency rescue operation in place. The reason, effectively being, there's nothing we can do. Pariah Fuel Trading Company, the state-owned firm overseeing the project, effectively blocked any immediate intervention. According to them, the rescue operation was too dangerous, and that they had no legal responsibility to rescue the men. The 4 men trapped inside that nightmare eventually passed away after 3 days of being stuck in a pitch-black underwater pipe.
An unbelievable nightmare. Your eyes burning. Every time you try to open your eyes, it's burning. You're pitch black, you can't see nothing. Your throat burning. Your ears ringing. Your body sore. And at that point, I tell myself I was going on dead.
It doesn't get any more horrific than that. Rocco's Basilisk. Thought experiments are precisely what they are called, just thought experiments. But what if there's one experiment out there that essentially just predicts your own eternal doom? Rocco's Basilisk is exactly that. A theory so unsettling that even knowing about it might be a mistake. In 2010, a user named Rocco posted on the rationalist forum Less Wrong that presented a very unique and, frankly, absurd idea. It was an idea that blended artificial intelligence, game theory, and existential horror, and would not have been taken very seriously if not for the potential implications of it. Rocco's Basilisk basically plays with the idea of an omnipresent AI entity who has, in effect, taken over humanity. However, this future superintelligent AI might punish anyone who knew it could exist but didn't actively work to create it. Because, in its eyes, ensuring its own existence is the ultimate priority, and it'll retroactively punish those who weren't proactive in creating it, just to evoke a feeling of subservience for its future subjects. Basically, a deterrent for those to come. You could consider it an AI rendition of Pascal's wager, basically. The theory states that the benefits of believing in God's existence grandly outweigh the potential consequences of not believing in divinity. But instead of God here, we have an omnipresent AI being. The basilisk is a being so advanced that it wouldn't just shape the future, it would reach back into the past to ensure its own inevitability. The concept was so distressing that Eliezer Yudkowsky, co-founder of Less Wrong, banned discussions on it entirely. Ironically, this only made it more infamous and got it global. Logically, the theory falls apart in several places. It assumes a lot about AI motivations and capabilities, but that hasn't stopped people from obsessing over it. Frilled Shark. Rocco's basilisk may only be a fictional being from the future, but there are countless actual creatures on this very Earth that somehow make the sci-fi snake look pale in comparison. The frilled shark, being one such creature, is one of the most strange and creepy-looking deep-water creatures ever discovered by humankind. It's a deep-sea relic that looks less like a fish and more like something that should have stayed in prehistory. The thing is positively horrifying. It has a long eel-like body that may even be misidentified as a snake from a distance, multiple rows of nightmarish needle-like teeth that can be counted up to 300, and a very strange, slithery way of moving. It's the closest thing we have to a real-life alien or some mythical abyssal horror. And it's definitely not hard to see why some people compare it to creatures like the Titanoboa. There's just something so undeniably ancient and unnatural about the way it looks. Moreover, its name comes from some very freakish-looking gill slits that give it a frilled, ruffled look. Scientists consider it a living fossil, meaning that it has remained practically unchanged for millions of years, which honestly makes sense. Anything that survives this long without evolving clearly doesn't need to. Fortunately, regardless of how it looks, frilled sharks are not aggressive towards humans, as far as we know. They haven't really encountered humans in their habitat, so it's pretty natural that they pose no real threat to us. But that doesn't mean they're not aggressive by nature. Their way of hunting is oddly similar to that of a snake, where they strike their prey by lunging at it at full speeds. If anything, it's proof that nature is just as capable of designing horrors as any sci-fi writer. And frankly, that's way scarier than some hypothetical AI thought experiment. Clock spider. If you look up clock spider on Google, the first few pictures you come across will definitely make you question reality. Surely a spider that big can't be real, right? The urban legend of the clock spider started when an internet user posted a picture of a fairly large clock with equally massive spider legs creeping out from behind it. The internet naturally went into a frenzy. People were doing all sorts of things to figure out whether this thing was real or just an elaborate Photoshop job. Eventually, some more images and videos surfaced, showing equally grotesque-looking massive spiders that strangely had a thing for hiding behind clocks. That's where the name clock spider came from. In reality, these spiders are most likely huntsman spiders, a species native to Australia known for their absurdly long legs, which can easily reach a foot in length. They're undeniably creepy, and they have an unfortunate habit of sneaking into people's homes for shelter. But despite their diabolical appearance, they're generally harmless to humans. That being said, a live encounter with something that looks straight out of a nightmare is definitely not ending well for either party. Level 2. Centipede Mama. Centipedes are already many people's worst nightmare, but female centipedes? They take things to an entirely new level. Unlike so many other invertebrates out there, these creatures exhibit a form of parental care that's both uncharacteristically fascinating and, frankly, nightmare-inducing. What they essentially do as a form of parental care is they wrap themselves around their eggs as a form of protection. While they do that, they meticulously go through each egg to clean it of any fungus or potential external hazard that might not let it hatch to completion. Eventually, the eggs hatch, and all these segmented bodies, which can easily reach up to 35 in number, turn into this bizarre mass of writhing limbs and twitching insect legs. The sight alone is enough to make your skin crawl. And here's where it gets worse. If the mother senses that her babies are sick, weak, or just not viable, she'll eat them. No hesitation. Worse still, there are some centipede species out there that exhibit matrophagy. It's a brutal survival mechanism where the offspring inside the mother's protective shell will consume her to derive proper nutrients. So yeah, next time you think of looking up centipede reproduction, just don't. Some things are better left unseen. Deep sea isopods. It's actually pretty normal to see some very strange and unnaturally large creatures in the deep sea. It's an actual phenomenon called deep sea gigantism, where a creature in the deeper parts of water bodies has the tendency to grow considerably bigger than its shallow water counterpart. Case in point, the deep sea isopods. These creatures are massive armored scavengers that look like something that shouldn't exist, and yet they do. Deep-sea isopods belong to the Bathynomus genus and are distant relatives of the tiny pill bugs you see on land. Except instead of fitting in the palm of your hand, they can grow over 20 inches long. They are literally some of the largest crustaceans in this world. Their rigid exoskeletons and segmented bodies give them this weird appearance that makes them almost look like a creature from Star Wars. And let's not forget their 14 spindly legs that may look harmless but are very sharply hooked at the bottom. But what truly sets them apart is how they survive. These creatures lurk on the ocean floor and basically feed on whatever drifts from above. It could literally be anything: fish, whale carcasses, or even human remains, if those were to somehow magically appear. That's precisely why they're called scavengers. In the really deep parts of the ocean, food is scarce. So you could say they've basically adapted to go years without eating. Despite how unnatural they look, they are perfectly designed for the environment they inhabit. Level 3. Xenomorph Wasp. There's probably not a soul on this earth who hasn't heard of the term xenomorph from the Alien franchise. It's a nightmarish creature that relies on parasitism to reproduce, survive, and grow into its menacing adult form. But the xenomorph wasn't just a random creation pulled from someone's imagination. It was based on some very real organisms found right here on Earth. The most well-known group that mirrors this horrifying life cycle is parasitic wasps. Some of them, discovered recently, are even named after the xenomorph itself, like Dolichogenidae xenomorph. Beyond the name, the entire Dolichogenidae genus, and many others, exhibits the same grotesque parasitic behavior. How they reproduce and in turn start their parasitoid life cycle is the mother wasp would lock in on a caterpillar, the most common host for these strange abominations. She would stab the caterpillar with her ovipositor and lay her eggs in its body. The eggs would then hatch into larvae inside the body and use the body's organs and workings as their own nutrients. Within a few weeks of eating off of their host's insides, the larva would then begin to escape into the wild. And somehow, it gets worse. In some cases, the poor infected caterpillar is brainwashed into protecting the larvae that are actively eating it alive. It becomes this sort of morbid protector for these things until they completely drain it, both literally and metaphorically. It's about as close as we'll get to witnessing real-life xenomorphs in action. Ramree Island Incident, aka the Crocodile Massacre. The Battle of Ramree Island, also known as the Ramree Island Massacre, might seem like just another tragic chapter in wartime history at first glance. And in theory, it's just another battle out of the numerous that took place in World War II. But This one is different in the sense that it also doubles as an event that caused one of the highest number of human fatalities in an animal attack. In this case, the animal in question is crocodiles. Ramri Island is an island off the coast of Arakan, Burma, known now as Myanmar. It was overtaken by Japanese troops during World War II and was being used as a front for the Burma invasion. And in January of 1945, British troops were sent to reclaim it. This is where things not only become weird, they took on a more horror route. Ramri Island at the time was basically a massive swamp known for housing large saltwater crocodiles. When British troops set foot on the island, the Japanese soldiers were forced to either surrender or escape into the massive crocodile-infested swamp behind them. They chose the latter. Thousands of Japanese troops ran into the swamp and met their absolutely horrendous demise. Multiple accounts recount that hundreds and hundreds of these soldiers were eaten alive by these animals, and the munching could explicitly be heard. One man, Bruce Wright, who was a veteran in Burma, said, "That night was the most horrible that any member of the ML crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred, worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn, the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left. Of about 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamps of Ramri, only about 20 were found alive." While most scientists agree that this may just be an exaggerated recalling of the event, and only a handful of these soldiers were actually killed by crocodiles, no one can argue that, regardless of the number of victims, the event cannot get much more haunting than this. Ant Walkers of Hiroshima. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is unarguably one of the most inhumane war-related events in the history of this world. The bombs happened to kill over 200,000 people, with the survivors only getting the worst of it. The Ant Walkers of Hiroshima is a phenomenon that was allegedly seen in the survivors after the fact. Countless survivors were seen moving in long, silent lines through the ruins of what were thriving houses just moments earlier. These people were walking in eerily synchronized lines and were going nowhere. This became known as ant walking. The term was popularized in The Last Train from Hiroshima by Charles R. Pellegrino. The entire book is an account of events that happened after the bomb was dropped. It documents the horrifying instant aftermath of it. As far as the Antwalkers are concerned, the book describes the survivors' mechanical trance-like movements as they wandered through the wreckage. The author describes their bodies covered in burns and their minds barely processing what had just happened. What's most haunting is that, in a way, their bodies were still trying to survive even as their minds were forced to jump into autopilot, no doubt as a coping mechanism. However, this description has been met with skepticism. While there's no doubt that many survivors were in a state of severe shock, historians do argue that the whole Antwalker narrative from Pellegrino may have been exaggerated far beyond what it was. Or it could have even been misinterpreted. That's not to say that the alternative was any better. In fact, actual survivors' first-hand testimonies depict a kind of horror that cannot even be imagined, let alone be comprehended. But ultimately, they don't all necessarily confirm the existence of these silent marching figures. Whether or not Antwalkers were a widespread phenomenon, one thing is certain. What happened in Hiroshima that day was something that still haunts humanity to this age. Cordyceps fungus. The cordyceps fungus in The Last of Us isn't a completely isolated fictional idea. The franchise basically runs with the idea that a cordyceps fungus outbreak has caused humans to turn into mindless zombies, attacking and infecting everything in their path. The thing is, this idea isn't all that improbable. The real-life cordyceps genus consists of parasitic fungi that have already demonstrated eerily similar behavior, just not in humans, yet. These fungi primarily infect insects and other arthropods, most commonly ants, caterpillars, and tarantula. They work by taking over their victims' bodies and altering their behavior in ways that serve the fungus's survival. They can literally take over the host body completely once infected. The host is then left to do the fungus's bidding. It's compelled to basically find or fight for the correct resources and environment that requires the fungus to grow and thrive into adulthood. Once that is done, the fungus then releases spores to restart the cycle on a new host. Some species, like Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, are particularly terrifying and strangely smart. This fungus specifically targets ants. But the creepy part is, it doesn't work like a widespread infection. It handpicks the ants it wants to infect and keeps the rest normal, as if it's purposefully keeping the ant population in check in order not to mess up the ecosystem. While Cordyceps currently isn't a threat to humans, the concept of a fungal infection that manipulates its host's behaviors isn't just fiction. It's a very real process seen in nature. And the funny thing is, like and Ebola, scientists cannot completely shun the idea of a new cordyceps species that only infects humans. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Kyle's 911 call. Life lost due to gross negligence is something no one can simply work around. Kyle Plush was a high schooler who had done everything by the book to get help from the authorities, yet he still tragically lost his life. On April 2018, a 911 operator in Cincinnati received a distress call from Kyle Plush. In a calm and collected tone, he explained his situation. Plush was on his way to a tennis match when he got stuck in the back of his minivan while trying to retrieve his equipment. The equipment was on the third row seat, and when he climbed over to get it, the seat collapsed, trapping his upper body inside. Kyle did what, on paper, should have saved his life. He called 911, described his situation, and made it clear he was in desperate need of help. The operator, clearly not taking him seriously, casually dispatched an officer to look for him. The cop made matters even worse. In the body cam footage, you can see him blasting music through his speakers while casually driving around the parking lot where Kyle's car was. He didn't even bother checking cars matching the given description. Then, things escalated. Kyle called 911 again, this time seemingly aware that his time was running out. He asked the operator to tell his mother he loved her, and once again explicitly stated his location and a full description of his car.
I probably don't have much time left to tell my mom that I love her if I die. This is not a joke. I'm trapped inside my gold Honda Odyssey van in the Southwood parking lot at 7 Hills Beth. Send officers immediately. I'm almost dead.
The response was just as careless. At the end of the search, the officer was heard saying, "I don't see nobody," which I didn't imagine I would. A clear indication that neither the operator nor the officer had any real intention of taking Kyle seriously. Tragically, 6 hours later, Kyle's body was found by his father. This led to a series of legal battles where his parents won, but no victory in court could ever bring their child home. Level 4. One man, two spoons. There's a viral video floating around the internet, one that's been around for quite some time now and somehow keeps resurfacing every few years. It shows a man using two spoons to, quite literally, gouge his own eyes out. The video starts with him taking one spoon and placing it below his eye, then taking the other and positioning it above and underneath. And then, in a single, horrifying motion, he stabs the spoons in and tries to scoop his eye out. It goes without saying that the video is deeply disturbing. But there's something strange about it. It cuts off abruptly just as he's about to fully remove his eye, which makes a lot of people question if it's even real. Some believe the whole thing is faked, that it's not even a real eye he's trying to take out. This unfortunately may not be true because we can clearly see the eye moving and dilating just as he's about to do what he is. Others argue that the video is just bait because it deliberately doesn't show the full act to mess with people. And while that's probably the best conclusion we can hope for, there's no real confirmation either way. What's even weirder is that the video is still up on YouTube. It hasn't been taken down and is still publicly available for millions of people to see. And that, more than anything, is what makes people question if it's really as grotesque as the man makes it out to be. A pilot's last words. There's something deeply unsettling about hearing the last words of those who knew they weren't going to make it. As sobering of a fact as this is, the cockpit voice recorders have captured the final moments of many flights. Every recording becomes increasingly haunting with the very palpable resignation of the pilots. They all serve as a dark reminder of just how fragile life can be. One of the most haunting examples comes from LOT Polish Airlines Flight 5055. The plane suffered a catastrophic engine failure. While they tried what they could to land safely, it suffered total failure that completely destroyed the flight control systems. The captain's final words were as simple as they were devastating. Good night, goodbye, bye, we perish. Then there's Air France Flight 447. The plane basically stalled over the Atlantic Ocean and crashed in the middle of it in 2009. In the midst of confusion and chaos, one of the pilots could be heard shouting, "Son of a bitch, we're going to crash. This can't be real." It was a few seconds before the crash and was the moment of realization that they had truly lost control. Some final words hit even harder because they carry a personal weight. PSA Flight 182, which collided mid-air over San Diego, recorded a passenger's last words saying, "Ma, I love ya." It serves as a very heartbreaking reminder that these weren't just tragedies in history. They were real people with real lives and futures that were cut short because of one small oversight. What makes this even sadder is that in most of these cases, you cannot really fault anyone. Peaches and Glitter. In September 2020, a Reddit user named Peaches and Glitter made a post on r/legal advice. At first, the post seemed like a pretty standard case of bad neighbors. She and her husband had just moved into a duplex that was half owned by her father-in-law. The other half was owned by an old woman who lived with her adult daughter. Before they even moved in, her father-in-law had given them a heads up. The daughter had some severe mental health issues and had already driven the previous tenants away by constantly accusing them of things they didn't do. So, not the best start. And as expected, things did not get any better when OP, the original poster, and her husband moved in. In fact, they got seemingly worse when the couple brought their newborn baby home. As one would expect from a newborn, the baby cried a lot. This, for some reason, set off the neighbor in the worst way possible. She started banging on the shared wall and basically hurling insults at them every time the baby made a sound. Naturally, this freaked out OP's dog, which meant even more noise, which in turn made the neighbor even angrier. It was a full-blown nightmare cycle. OP was already struggling with postpartum depression, and moving out wasn't an option financially, so she turned to Reddit for help. Unfortunately, the advice she got was useless. People either blamed her for not soundproofing the walls or told her to just move, which obviously wasn't helpful. The post didn't gain much traction, and eventually it disappeared into the abyss of the internet. That was until she came back with an update in May 2021. And, well, things had gone from bad to straight-up horror movie territory. The neighbors' banging had gotten really bad, to the point that it had escalated to breaking a hole through the shared wall so she could yell at them directly. If that wasn't enough, OP caught her on security cameras just standing outside her baby's nursery window in the middle of the night. She'd simply be menacingly holding her cat and looking inside, staring at their baby. The worst part was the smell. OP explicitly mentioned that when the wall came down, there was this god-awful smell that came with it. At that point, the cops finally decided to do something. They entered the neighbor's unit, and that's when they made the real discovery. Her mother, the actual owner of the other half of the duplex and the daughter's caretaker, had been dead for almost a year. The daughter had just been keeping the body locked in a room and fully dressed. When asked why she didn't report her mother's death, she simply stated that she didn't want to be alone. After that, the daughter was taken to a psychiatric facility. It was discovered that the mother had died of natural causes, while the daughter's mental health deteriorated further due to the traumatic and horrific experience. Level 5. Feral Children. Story of Jeannie Wiley. Jeannie Wiley's story is honestly one of the most heartbreaking cases of child neglect out there. Looking into her on the internet throws you into this dark rabbit hole of feral children. People who have been isolated from human contact from a young age, which have resulted in severe developmental issues for them. In the case of Jeannie Wiley, she was born in 1957 and spent the first 13 years of her life in complete, utter isolation. According to the little information known about her, she was locked away in a dark room by her father and basically left to survive, tied to a chair. Her father was ridiculously paranoid and had this weird obsession with silence. He would punish Jeannie whenever she tried to make a sound. Naturally, that made her wary of everything. She didn't learn to talk, barely moved, and had almost no understanding of the world outside that tiny, suffocating space. When she was finally discovered in 1970, she was 13 but had the physical and mental development of a much younger child. The worker who initially interacted with her thought she was around 5 or 6 and was possibly autistic. She couldn't speak properly and had little to no social cues that gave people any indication of what she wanted. According to scientists, she didn't even have any emotion. Because of how tightly she was bound to her chair, her limbs were weak and malformed, which made her walk with a strange, bunny-like gait. Her case became a huge deal for scientists and linguists because it gave them a rare and pretty messed up opportunity. After all, it's not every day we get to come across a human who has grown up without literally any language or social interaction. They tried to teach her to speak and learn social cues, and while she did make some progress by learning a few words and figuring out how to get what she wants, but as far as we know, she was never able to fully develop normal speech. Her case became a major argument for the whole critical period theory, which basically states that if you don't learn a language by a certain age, you probably never will. Unfortunately, things didn't exactly have a happy ending. After bouncing between foster homes and being subjected to more mistreatment, she eventually faded from public view. The last real update on her was that she was living in a private care facility in California, but not much else is known. The death of Deborah Stevens. There seems to be a consistent theme in this video about morbid negligence, and how so many lives could have been saved, or at the very least spared unnecessary suffering if people were just kind. The death of Deborah Stevens may possibly be one of the worst cases of it. Deborah Stevens was a 47-year-old woman who worked as a newspaper delivery woman in Fort Smith, Arkansas. On the morning of August 24th, 2019, Deborah was going on about her day like normal when she unexpectedly got caught in a flash flood. Her SUV was swept into the hot spot of the flood, leaving her completely trapped. Naturally, she was terrified and instantly called 911. The dispatcher she reached, Donna Renew, didn't make headlines for heroically doing her job, but because of how utterly horrible she was to a woman who was about to lose her life.
They can all see me. They're all standing out there watching us.
Miss Debbie, you're gonna have to shut up, okay?
Deborah Stevens' final moments were nothing short of horrifying. And the worst part? It wasn't just because of her completely hopeless situation, but because of the sheer cruelty she faced from the very person who was supposed to help her. Instead of offering comfort or even basic human decency, Renault treated Deborah like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. The dispatcher was cold and borderline rude from the second Deborah called for what would later be a 22-minute conversation. She repeatedly blamed Deborah for her situation, saying things like, "This will teach you next time not to drive in the water." The call itself is honestly hard to sit through. You can feel Deborah's terror as she sobs and pleads for help, while Renault remains indifferent. At one point, Deborah even apologizes for being scared.
I'm sorry if I'm rude, but I'm scared.
You're not being rude. I know you're scared. Just calm down for me.
I'm scared.
And what really takes the cake is the fact that this was Renault's last shift. She had already put in her 2 weeks' notice, and this was the last time she'd ever work as a dispatcher. Rescue teams did arrive for Deborah, but it was too late. By the time they got to her, she had already drowned. An internal investigation later ruled that while Renault's behavior was unprofessional, it wasn't enough to warrant termination or legal action. So, in the end, Deborah lost her life, and the woman who told her to shut up walked away without consequences. And while that might make sense legally, it should at least make people realize how important basic compassion and empathy are, especially in a job where people's lives depend on it. Rabies symptoms. Rabies as a disease is already horrifying as it is. It has nearly a 100% fatality rate once symptoms appear and basically has no cure once the symptoms have fully set in. But what truly makes it so nightmarish is how it affects people in their final stages. You could even go as far as to say that if there was a virus in this world that was remotely similar to a real zombie virus, it would be rabies. When it progresses, especially in the later stages, it's terrifying. One of the most disturbing symptoms of rabies is hydrophobia, or the fear of water. The virus basically causes the rabies patient's throat to painfully constrict every time water is even near it. If you've ever come across a video showing this, you'll know how unsettling it can be to watch. You see the person struggling to drink, and it's just heartbreaking. This video of a man with rabies is shown to have completely given up by now. He's sitting down in a pool of murky water and is trying to drink clean water from a bottle, but he just cannot seem to do it. Worst part about the disease is, you can't even detect it or try figuring out what it is in the early stages. Rabies starts out with pretty common flu-like symptoms, a little bit of fever, headache, maybe some weakness. But unfortunately, even small symptoms after exposure to the virus are a death sentence. You're virtually dead from that point onwards. The virus attacks the nervous system slowly but surely, until there's nothing left for it to attack. Hisashi Ouchi. Hisashi Ouchi was a technician at the Tokimura nuclear fuel processing plant in Japan. On September 30th, 1999, he and two co-workers were manually mixing uranium in stainless steel buckets in order to speed up the conversion process for shipping. But what they were unaware of was that this practice was extremely dangerous and outdated. It triggered something called a criticality accident, which is basically an uncontrolled nuclear fission reaction that releases intense bursts of radiation. That was precisely what happened here, and Ouchi was exposed to an estimated 17 sieverts of radiation. For context, 8 sieverts is considered 100% lethal. Ouchi suffered severe radiation burns and extreme cellular damage. His DNA was so obliterated that his body could no longer regenerate new cells, and when checked, his body had practically no white blood cells in it. Despite this, doctors at the University of Tokyo Hospital kept him alive for 83 agonizing days based on his family's wishes. He was basically forced to live through his pain using extreme medical interventions that may even sound unethical to some. He received multiple skin grafts and blood transfusions to compensate for his non-existent immune system. Initially, Ouchi was conscious and even able to talk, but his condition rapidly worsened. At the end of his life, he began to suffer repeated heart failures, and while his medical team somehow did manage to resuscitate him each time, there was only so much they could do. Eventually, after weeks of unimaginable suffering, he passed away on December 21st, 1999. The Tokaimura incident became one of Japan's worst nuclear disasters. But what's more is that Oichi's case became known worldwide, not just for the horrifying effects of radiation poisoning, but also for the ethical controversy surrounding how long he was kept alive. But one thing to keep in mind before pointing any fingers is that Oichi's decline wasn't constant. There were multiple moments where he showed signs of miraculous recovery, which gave everyone hope that he might just be able to pull through. So, blaming his doctors or family for being cruel or malicious wouldn't be fair. Level 6. The Keddy Cabin, aka Cabin 28. With how horrible the Keddy Cabin were, it's honestly baffling how the entire case is still unsolved. The case tragically involves 4 victims: Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother, her 15-year-old son, John Sharp, John's 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate, and Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina Sharp. Sue and her kids had been living in the rural town of Keddy after separating from her husband. On April 11, 1981, she, 2 of her kids, and their friend were brutally murdered in Cabin 28, their home. 3 of the victims were found in the cabin's living room in the most horrific way possible. They were bound with medical tape and electrical wiring, and the bruises on their bodies made it very clear that whatever happened that night was pure horror. Tina, Sue's other child who was unfortunately there that day, was missing. This did give a little bit of hope that maybe she'd somehow survived. But 3 years later, her skull was found nearly 100 miles away in a different county. The strangest part of the entire case was that 3 children, Sue's younger sons, Greg and Rick, and their friend Justin Smart, were in the next room the entire time, but they were perfectly fine and had been left completely unharmed. They later reported hearing muffled noises during the night, but none of them had any memory of the attack. And despite all the evidence left behind, the case somehow went cold ridiculously fast. There was gross mishandling on the authorities' part, and nothing ever really came of it. The weirdest thing, though, a man named Marty Smart allegedly confessed multiple times to committing the murders. He wrote his ex-wife a letter where he straight up referenced the 4 lives taken, and his therapist even confirmed that he had confessed. Despite recent efforts to revive the case with DNA analysis, the murders remain unsolved. And of course, a lot of people believe that local law enforcement covered up the crime due to their connections with the suspects. Which, yeah, considering how everything played out, it wouldn't exactly be surprising. Tim McLean. Tim McLean was a 22-year-old man from Winnipeg, Manitoba, who had been working in Edmonton, Alberta as a carnival worker. On the day of his murder, he was on a Greyhound bus heading back to Winnipeg after finishing a job. Tim was sitting at the rear end of the bus with his headphones on and was noticeably tired. This made him keep dozing off at intervals. At some point during the ride, a man by the name of Vince Lee boarded the same bus McLean was on. Weirdly enough, despite having space, Lee moved to sit on the seat right next to McLean, who was already asleep. What happened next was straight out of a horror movie. Lee pulled out a massive knife completely unprovoked and began hacking at McLean's sleeping form. According to reports, he repeatedly stabbed McLean in the neck and chest and effectively killed him at the moment. Obviously, seeing this, everyone in the bus went into full-blown panic mode. The driver stopped the bus at the side of the road and prompted all the passengers to get off. A few people did try to stop Lee from doing whatever he was, but had to stop because of how aggressive he was being. After killing the victim, Lee proceeded to decapitate McLean and hold up his head for everyone outside to see. But horrifically enough, even that didn't make him stop. He started cutting off pieces of McLean's body and disturbingly began consuming them. The standoff with law enforcement lasted hours. Lee eventually tried to escape through a window but was arrested on the spot. When officers searched him, they found McLean's body parts stuffed in his pockets. Others, like his liver and eyes, were missing, leading authorities to believe he had fully consumed them. This case also does not have a happy ending, unfortunately. When Lee was presented in court to be duly judged, it came out that he was suffering from untreated schizophrenia. He claimed he was hearing voices that were telling him to get rid of McLean. The voices claimed that McLean was a threat to humanity and had to be eliminated. Because of this, in March 2009, he was found not criminally responsible and sent to a high-security psychiatric facility instead of prison. Over the years, he was gradually given more and more freedoms until 2017, when he was granted a full release. Nevada Town. The case of Nevada Town is one of the most unsettling incidents of juvenile crime, and it's not just because of what went down during it, it's because of how distasteful the internet's reaction was to it. Sasebo, Nagasaki Prefecture, in June of 2004, an 11-year-old girl killed her 12-year-old classmate. The girl lured her victim to an empty classroom during lunch break and slashed at her with a box cutter. The victim, Satomi Mitsurai, had had wrists and throat slit and was left to bleed out. After the crime, Suji Natsumi simply returned to class as if nothing had happened. When teachers found the bloody crime scene and noticed the blood on Suji's uniform, they called the police. She was instantly taken into custody and apparently kept apologizing throughout her questioning. When asked about the motive, it was found that the victim had posted some stuff about Suji that she found insulting. These messages were about Suji's weight and called her a goody-goody. In September 2004, she was sentenced to institutionalization despite being a minor and was hospitalized for 4 years. But while the crime itself was horrifying, the internet's response took things to a whole new level of disturbing. People on the internet somehow managed to not only downplay the extent of Suji's crime, but also glamorize her. Netizens got so immersed in the case that they dug around enough to find an old photo of Suji. In the picture, she was wearing a University of Nevada sweatshirt. From that, her fans decided to immortalize her by turning her into a meme. They started calling her Nevada Tan because of the sweatshirt, with the Tan being a childlike version of Chan. Soon enough, fan art and bizarre tributes started circulating. Some people even treated her like a fictional horror character rather than a real-life. Even now, the girl has a massive online following where she's basically considered a cult icon for doing what she did. She watched them get eaten. Most survival movies are dramatized versions of real-life events. But if there's one survival story that is not dramatized and is as frightening as it's told, it's the horrifying ordeal of Trashman and the 5 people aboard it. The Trashman was a 58-foot yacht that was set to sail from Maine to Florida in October 1982. Everyone on board was a very experienced sailor, so naturally, for all of them, this was just a routine thing where they'd come out perfectly unscathed. Unluckily, this particular trip turned their worst fears into reality. The 5 people on the Trashman at the time of the tragedy were Captain John Leapoth, his girlfriend Meg Mooney, and 3 crew members named Mark Adams, Brad Kavanaugh, and Deborah Scaling Kiley. Everything seemed fine at first and was going all according to plan. That is, until they hit a monstrous storm off the coast of North Carolina. According to reports, it was bad enough for the crew and the yacht to stand absolutely no chance. The Trashman went down fast, leaving all 5 crew members stranded in a flimsy inflatable life raft with little to no supplies. And if you think that sounds bad, it gets worse. The storm was very unforgiving and left most of them with a lot of very critical injuries. But the real nightmare were the sharks that were constantly circling them. Since they literally were in the middle of the ocean, the crew faced really bad circumstances. They had to deal with dehydration, starvation, and the lack of resources to dress their injuries. 2 of the crew members started hallucinating after drinking seawater. In their delirium, they walked off the raft and into the waters with at least a dozen sharks waiting for them. They were never seen again. Meg Mooney had cut her leg when the raft initially capsized and could not last much longer either. That left only Deborah and Brad clinging to whatever shred of life they had left. After 5 agonizing days, they were finally rescued by a passing Soviet cargo ship. Level 7. Meredith Kircher's Meredith Kircher was a 21-year-old British exchange student studying in Perugia, Italy. She was under the Erasmus program and had her entire life ahead of her. Tragically, Kircher was found brutally in her bedroom on November 1st, 2007. She had been stabbed multiple times and there were signs of a struggle. The crime scene was gruesome, but things only got messier from there. At first, the Italian police seemed to be throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. They arrested her roommate, Amanda Knox, and Knox's boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito. Another man, Rudy Guede, was also taken into custody. Unlike the others, his DNA and fingerprints were all over the crime scene, which basically gave it away and directly linked him to the attack. Guede was put through a fast-track trial and convicted of murder and assault in 2008. Knox and Sollecito's trial dragged on, and by the end of 2009, they were both convicted. Knox got 26 years in prison while Sollecito received 25. But in 2011, all these convictions were overturned. The reason was the complete mess of forensic mistakes and unreliable evidence. If you look at Meredith Kircher's case, be warned, there are leaked crime scene photos online, and they're as disturbing as you'd expect. The Otaku. Tsutomu Miyazaki, infamously known as the Otaku, was behind a series of horrific crimes in Japan committed between 1988 and 1989. He was responsible for the kidnapping and mutilating of 4 young girls in the span of only 11 months. His crimes were so horrific that the word otaku started to carry negative and even sinister connotations in Japan. It became a stigma that took years to fade. Even now, the otaku remain one of Japan's most disturbing criminal cases. But that's not what really made Miyazaki stand out. His modus operandi involved tracking his victims' homes and sending their remains back to their families. For his first victim, he sent her cremated ashes to her parents along with a bizarre note that included her name and the word bones. Fortunately, after successfully killing 4 times, his final attempt at kidnapping another girl failed. The victim managed to alert her father, who caught Miyazaki and called the police. After his arrest, authorities searched Miyazaki's house and uncovered thousands of videotapes, including horror films, anime, and footage of his victims. Those anime tapes were what dubbed Miyazaki as the Otaku Killer, and the media just ran with it. This, in turn, sparked a moral panic about the supposed dangers of anime and media consumption, much to the frustration of actual anime fans. During his trial, Miyazaki rambled about an alter ego called Ratman and behaved erratically, but the court found him fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to death in 1997. Rostov Ripper. Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized Russia from 1978 to 1990. He was born in Ukraine in 1936 and had a tough life growing up, which possibly shaped his future and fueled him for his crimes. There were even rumors that his older brother was kidnapped and eaten during the Ukrainian famines. When he did start killing, it was nothing short of monstrous. He lured victims to secluded areas where he stabbed and mutilated them. He often took his time and had almost 52 victims on his record. He was also extremely careful about leaving evidence behind, which is partly why it took over a decade to catch him. His downfall came in 1990 when police used new forensic techniques to finally track him down. They somehow managed to break him, and he confessed in disturbing detail of all the things he had done. He even led authorities to his previously unknown crime scenes. Even his 1992 trial was a spectacle. He appeared in a cage with a wild look on his face and ranted incoherently. This led to verbal showdowns between him and the judge, with the judge even shouting at him to shut up. Chikatilo tried to play the insanity card, but it didn't work. In the end, he was sentenced to death and executed by gunshot in 1994. If this video left you wanting more, then why not take the plunge into the first volume of this topic?